Greg Miller had always considered himself a normal man living a quiet, uncomplicated life. He taught high school math in Fairview, a small town in Oregon where everyone seemed to know everyone else. His world revolved around routine: wake up before sunrise, make coffee, drive the same 10-minute route to school, teach 5 classes, and come home to his wife and 2 teenage kids. The Miller family lived in a modest 2-story house with a big backyard and a detached garage Greg had always treated like a personal sanctuary. On weekends, when he wasn't grading papers or mowing the lawn, he'd spend hours in that garage fixing broken furniture, tinkering with old electronics, or just enjoying the silence. To anyone on the outside, his life looked like something out of a neighborhood brochure: stable, predictable, and completely unremarkable. That all changed on a cold, overcast Saturday in early March. The snow had just melted, revealing muddy grass and fallen branches scattered across the yard. With spring approaching, Greg decided it was time to clear out the garage, a task he'd been putting off for years. It wasn't unusual for him to tackle small projects like this on his own. He actually enjoyed sorting through things, organizing shelves, and finding items he'd forgotten he even owned. As he rolled up the garage door that morning, a gust of cold air met him. The smell of motor oil, dust, and old wood filled his nose. He sipped his coffee, rolled up his sleeves, and started moving boxes. The clutter had built up slowly over the years: boxes from their last move, Christmas decorations, half-used paint cans, old sports gear the kids no longer touched. Greg worked methodically, dragging each item into the driveway, dusting off labels, and deciding what to keep and what to toss. But after a few hours, he noticed something odd. In the far back corner of the garage, there was a set of wooden shelves loaded with rusted tools, empty jars, and a few outdated car manuals. As he began to empty them, one of the bottom shelves wobbled slightly when he leaned against it. Curious, he pushed it a little harder. The entire shelf shifted forward with a creak. Behind it was something he had never noticed before: a narrow section of wall covered with old insulation and painted to match the rest of the garage. It looked almost like part of the structure, but something felt off. He cleared the remaining clutter and examined it closely. Hidden beneath a loose panel was a small, rotting wooden door, no taller than his waist. It was sealed with old nails and a thin metal latch, the kind you might see on an antique trunk. Greg paused. He'd lived in this house for nearly 10 years and had never once suspected this hidden door existed. Part of him hesitated, unsure whether to open it. But curiosity, and something deeper he couldn't quite name, pushed him forward. As he pried the door open with a crowbar, a sharp, musty smell hit him. The space behind it was small, dark, and cold. He fumbled for a flashlight and aimed the beam inside. That's when he saw it: a chair, some dusty boxes, and something that looked like a stack of photographs wrapped in plastic. A chill ran down his spine. He realized this wasn't just a storage space. It was something else entirely. Greg stood frozen at the entrance of the hidden room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through layers of dust that floated like ash in the still air. The space was no larger than a walk-in closet, with concrete walls stained by time and neglect. The smell of mold and something more sour clung to the surfaces like a warning. He stepped inside cautiously, his boots scraping against the cold floor. The air was stale, untouched for years, and it felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. At first glance, the room appeared empty except for a few items scattered along the back wall: an old folding chair, cracked and worn, a milk crate filled with random household junk, and a cardboard box sealed shut with multiple layers of duct tape. Greg crouched in front of the box, his hands shaking slightly as he peeled the tape away. Inside were objects that made his stomach twist: a stack of driver's licenses, each with a different woman's name and face. Most of them were young, in their 20s, with friendly smiles frozen in time. Next to the licenses were photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids, yellowed with age. Each one depicted a different woman, many looking afraid or dazed. Some appeared to be taken in the very room Greg now stood in. There were also clear plastic bags, each labeled with dates and names, containing strands of hair and small personal items: lipsticks, earrings, torn pieces of clothing. The deeper Greg looked into the box, the more grotesque the contents became. Handwritten notes were tucked between the photos and plastic bags, each page scrawled in messy, hurried ink. They read like journal entries, cataloging the women with disturbing detail: their ages, where they had been taken from, their behavior, and how long they had been kept. There were even chilling observations, like how long it took each one to cry, or whether they had begged for their lives. Greg slammed the lid shut, his face pale. He stumbled back out of the room and into the garage, gasping for breath. The horrifying realization hit him all at once. He hadn't discovered a forgotten storage space or an old panic room. He had just uncovered what looked like a trophy room belonging to a serial predator. Greg ran into the house, still clutching one of the licenses, and called the police. When officers arrived, they took one look inside the secret room and called for backup. Within hours, crime scene tape wrapped around the property. Forensic teams swarmed the garage, documenting every inch. Investigators worked late into the night, collecting every item from the hidden space and sending it off for analysis. The room, hidden in plain sight for who knows how many years, was now at the center of a full-scale investigation. What shocked authorities most was the level of organization. Whoever had used the room had clearly done so many times and had kept detailed records. Yet no one had ever reported this house as being connected to any known criminal cases. The evidence suggested these crimes hadn't happened recently. They stretched back years, even decades. And until Greg's accidental discovery, no one had even come close to finding this place, and the days following the discovery, the Miller home transformed from a peaceful suburban house into the center of a sprawling investigation. News vans lined the street, neighbors gathered behind barricades, and crime scene technicians came and went in shifts, carrying boxes of evidence out of the garage. The hidden room had been sealed off while forensic teams worked around the clock, analyzing every inch. Detectives began piecing together a timeline, cross-referencing the names and photos found in the box with old missing persons reports. Almost immediately, they began to see a disturbing pattern. Several of the women whose driver's licenses were found had been reported missing between 1998 and 2005, all from towns within a 100-mile radius. At the time, the cases had seemed unrelated. Different towns, different circumstances, different jurisdictions. But now, with the evidence from Greg's garage, they realized they had all likely been victims of the same person. The similarities were undeniable. Each woman had disappeared without a trace, usually after a night out or while walking home alone. In every case, no body was ever found. Families had been left with unanswered questions, the cases slowly going cold as the years passed. The photos and personal items found in the secret room painted a horrifying picture. It wasn't just about taking trophies. This person had kept meticulous records, as if he was studying his victims. For detectives, the next logical step was figuring out who had access to the house during that time period. Greg and his family had only lived there since 2014, and there was no indication they had any connection to the victims. Their background checks came back clean, and there was no evidence the room had been used in the past decade. Property records showed the home had previously belonged to a man named Leonard Crayton, a retired postal worker who had died of a heart attack in the house in 2013. He had lived there alone for many years and had no criminal history. Neighbors remembered Leonard as quiet, polite, and reclusive. No one ever suspected anything unusual. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered something unexpected. Leonard had a younger brother, Thomas Crayton, who had once stayed with him for an extended period in the early 2000s. Strangely, Thomas had seemingly vanished around 2005. There were no death records, no forwarding address, no signs of activity after that year. At first, this raised more questions than answers. Why had no one looked for Thomas? Why hadn't Leonard reported his disappearance? When detectives interviewed Leonard's former acquaintances and combed through public records, they found almost nothing about Thomas after 2005. What they did uncover, however, was that he had a troubled past. Old employment files showed a history of erratic behavior, frequent moves, and unexplained gaps in his background. Suddenly, Thomas Crayton emerged as a possible suspect, one who had lived inside the house during the same period when the women went missing. The evidence was beginning to align. Investigators now had a working theory. Thomas Crayton had used the garage room as a base for his crimes, and when he disappeared in 2005, the crimes stopped. The timeline matched perfectly. But the most chilling question remained: where was Thomas now? And if he was dead, who had made sure he stayed hidden? As the investigation intensified, all eyes turned to Thomas Crayton. Though he had remained a footnote in his brother's life story for years, he was now the prime suspect in a case that spanned more than a decade of horror. Detectives scoured through every document, interview, and digital footprint they could find, hoping to uncover what had happened to him. But there was nothing. No phone records, no bank activity, no tax filings. It was as if he had vanished into thin air after 2005. Investigators returned to the house, convinced they had missed something, and began searching every inch beyond the garage. That's when they found the attic door. Hidden behind a panel in the hallway ceiling, the entrance to the attic hadn't been used in years. Dust coated the pull-down ladder, and once opened, a rush of stale, dry air spilled out. Inside, the attic was cluttered with old boxes, insulation, and forgotten junk. But in the far corner, tucked beneath a mound of tarp, was a large, beat-up suitcase. It was oddly heavy, sealed with duct tape and a single rusted chain. When authorities opened it, the truth they had been chasing finally came to light. Inside the suitcase were human remains, mostly bone, with fragments of decayed clothing and scraps of paper. Forensic testing confirmed the worst. It was Thomas Crayton. Alongside the remains were items that painted a grim picture: a driver's license, an old journal, and a photograph of Leonard and Thomas from the early 2000s. The journal was key. Its contents revealed that Leonard had become aware of Thomas's crimes, possibly by accident, after noticing strange behavior and finding disturbing items in the garage. At first, Leonard had tried to reason with him. The entries described late-night arguments, a growing sense of fear, and finally, the moment Leonard realized his brother was beyond help. The final journal entry was written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Leonard described confronting Thomas one last time and hinted that things got out of hand. He never used the word murder, but the implication was clear. He had killed his brother, either in self-defense or out of a desperate need to stop the nightmare that had taken root in his home. Rather than report the incident, Leonard had chosen silence. He concealed the body in the attic, sealed off the secret room in the garage, and tried to erase the evidence of what had happened. The decision to cover up the truth had kept the families of the victims in the dark for years. And though Leonard had died before ever being held accountable, his actions, both in protecting others from Thomas and in hiding what he knew, were now part of the case's complicated legacy. Investigators were left with a story of two brothers, one who had committed unspeakable acts and another who had carried the weight of those crimes in silence. The public was stunned. What had started with a man cleaning out his garage had uncovered not just a killer, but a family secret buried deeper than anyone could have imagined. And the weeks that followed the final discoveries, the Miller home remained taped off and under investigation. Greg and his family had moved into temporary housing, still reeling from the shock of what had unfolded beneath their own roof. News of the case spread nationwide. Headlines labeled the house everything from a hidden house of horrors to America's quietest crime scene. What unsettled people the most wasn't just the brutality of Thomas Crayton's crimes, but how easily they had been forgotten, buried behind a false wall, right in the middle of a quiet suburb. The story captured imaginations and fears alike. People began to question their own homes, their own histories, and how much could be hidden in plain sight. Forensic teams continued their slow and meticulous work, sifting through every scrap of evidence left behind. More audio recordings were found, stashed in a locked toolbox inside the hidden room. The tapes featured chilling content, muffled sounds, pleading voices, and the detached tone of a man documenting suffering like scientific data. Alongside these were additional notes that helped investigators connect more cold cases to Thomas Crayton. Each page offered sickening details, times, dates, behaviors. They were written without emotion, as though the lives stolen meant nothing more than a list of symptoms. DNA analysis provided even more answers. Strands of hair and traces of blood found in the garage matched multiple women who had vanished between 1999 and 2004. Authorities reached out to families across the state, some of whom had given up hope years ago. Though painful, they finally had closure. Memorials were held, and photos of the victims were shown on national news. For many, these women had been reduced to file numbers, long forgotten by the system. Now, at last, their stories were being told. DNA analysis provided even more answers. Strands of hair and traces of blood found in the garage matched multiple women who had vanished between 1999 and 2004. Authorities reached out to families across the state, some of whom had given up hope years ago. Though painful, they finally had closure. Memorials were held, and photos of the victims were shown on national news. For many, these women had been reduced to file numbers, long forgotten by the system. Now, at last, their stories were being told. Greg Miller found himself at the center of a strange kind of spotlight. Though he had no connection to the crimes, he had become the accidental hero who uncovered them. He gave one brief interview to a local paper before retreating entirely from public life. Friends said he struggled with the guilt of not having discovered the room sooner. His garage, once a place of peace and routine, had become a symbol of trauma. The family later sold the house, and the new owners announced plans to demolish the garage entirely. What lingered most, even after the investigations were closed, was the sheer silence of it all. The idea that Thomas had committed so many crimes from inside a home, without ever drawing suspicion, disturbed everyone who heard the story. There had been no screams, no signs of struggle. Just a quiet man in a quiet neighborhood, hiding a secret no one thought to look for. It reminded the world that the worst horrors aren't always loud. Sometimes they're buried behind walls, hidden under floors, and disguised as ordinary life. The house on Maple Street eventually stood empty, quiet once more. But the story of what happened there would never be forgotten. Not by the families who finally got answers. Not by the investigators who uncovered the truth. And certainly not by the man who opened the door and stepped into darkness.